You know that feeling? Just completely buried under news alerts, headlines, trying to figure out what's actually going
Oh
on.
yeah, information overload.
Exactly. So that's what we're here for. This deep dive, it's your shortcut based completely on the source material you've given us.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're digging into these sources about, well, recent political stuff, a budget bill mostly,
Right?
and we've got material focusing on key figures and, wow, some really different reactions to it all.
And our job, just to be clear, is to unpack this material. We're looking at a video transcript, mainly from Midas Touch, talking about Speaker Mike Johnson, some reactions,
Okay.
other politicians, the channel's own view. We're just pulling out the main points, the different takes, maybe some surprising bits, all from within these pages.
And crucially, like always, we're just reporting what the sources say, not adding our own opinions, no outside stuff.
Absolutely. Impartial reporting on the source content.
Perfect. Think of us as guides just for this specific information you shared. Okay then, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
So the source material starts off by painting a pretty vivid picture of Speaker Mike Johnson's recent media appearances, Sunday shows specifically. What's the source's angle on how that went?
Well, vivid is one word for it. The source, it uses some really strong language right away. It calls his appearances catastrophic.
Wow.
Yeah, and awful, terrible. It really sets a particular tone from the get-go in this material.
Okay, so definitely not subtle from the source's perspective. And it wasn't just his TV stuff, right? The material also says he was getting flack from his own side.
That's right. The source specifically mentions Magi Republicans in the Senate, says they were also criticizing this budget bill.
Hmm.
So it kind of positions him as, being squeezed from different directions, according to this document.
Okay, speaking of that Republican criticism, the source material details some specific viewpoints. Senator Rand Paul, for instance. What does it say about him?
Well, the source quotes Rand Paul using similarly strong words about the bill itself. He called it atrocious, ridiculous, horrible.
Goodness. And the source includes more, right? Something about emperors.
Yes, it quotes him describing Donald Trump and Speaker Johnson as the emperors with no clothes. And he's also quoted expressing, like, real fear for the country if people don't stand up.
So it sounds like, based on the source, a pretty deep fundamental opposition.
And he gets into the money side, as the source presents it. He argues that raising the debt ceiling, which he claims is by $4 to $5 trillion in this bill,
Right.
that basically guarantees deficits of at least $2 trillion a year for the next 2 years. He's directly linking that debt ceiling number to future spending, as he sees it.
And the source mentions his voting position. He'd consider it if...
The debt ceiling part was taken out. That's what the quote says. But a $5 trillion increase, he says he absolutely cannot vote for that.
Okay.
And the source kind of ends his section with him asking, isn't there anyone left in Washington who thinks debt is just wrong?
And the source brings in another senator, too, Ron Johnson.
Yes, Senator Ron Johnson. He's quoted calling the bill immoral, says it'll bankrupt America.
And his stance, according to the source, pretty firm.
Very firm. He says, quote, he will derail it in the Senate.
Huh?
And the source makes a point of contrasting his, deep worry about debt with what it claims President Trump reportedly said. Something like, debt is not really top of mind.
Interesting contrast presented there. Did the source include that analogy he used?
It did, yeah. The Disney World one.
Yeah.
He's quoted saying, somebody's got to be the dad that says, I know y'all want to go to Disney World, but we can't afford it. I guess I'm going to be that guy.
Right.
And he apparently ties this back to a campaign promise he's had since 2010 about not mortgaging the future. That's the context the source provides.
The material also quotes him mentioning unprecedented level of increased spending, something like 58% since 2019.
Yeah, 58% since 2019, excluding World War II spending. That's the figure cited in the source. And he's presented as believing, spending could be rolled back to pre-pandemic levels.
And that cuts could be made that people wouldn't even notice.
That's the claim the source includes, yeah.
Yeah.
That spending could be eliminated and people wouldn't even notice.
It's interesting how the source uses these specific quotes, these numbers from both senators, to really build its narrative about the Republican opposition here.
Definitely. It highlights the arguments the source wants you, the listener, to focus on.
Okay, so we've seen the criticism from the right, as laid out in the sources. Then the material seems to shift to Speaker Johnson's responses and how the source itself frames his defense.
Right. And the source claims visually that Speaker Johnson was struggling. Uses phrases like mumbling and stumbling.
And a big point the source makes is about him apparently attacking the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO.
Yeah, which is, usually the standard scorekeeper in D.C.
Exactly. And the source immediately provides this contrast, claiming Johnson's own team had used CBO numbers and talking points just earlier that week.
Interesting juxtaposition there from the source.
So why did he attack the CBO estimates, according to the source?
Well, the source quotes him calling the estimates wildly inaccurate. His reasoning, as presented, is that they assume a historically low growth rate.
Okay.
And he argues the bill, despite all the criticism, will actually be like jet fuel for the economy. Boosting growth, jobs, manufacturing.
And he compared it to the first Trump administration?
Yeah, he invoked that, calling it the greatest economy, and claiming this bill would be like that, but on steroids this time. That's a direct quote the source uses for his economic defense.
But then the source challenges him on tariffs, right? It brings up Goldman Sachs.
It does. It confronts him with a Goldman Sachs report that supposedly said the negative growth impact from tariffs would more than offset any positive boost from the bill.
Implying the tariffs are actually a net negative for growth in that view. How did Johnson respond, according to the material?
He's quoted saying he respects Goldman Sachs, but was discounting their view on this. He kind of doubled down, claiming growth will happen from the bill.
Right.
And that the so-called tariff war is beginning to subside already. That's his claim presented in the source.
And the source includes his reasoning, something about other countries renegotiating.
Yeah, he's quoted saying over 75 countries are renegotiating trade deals because of Trump's stance, and that this will ultimately help Americans.
Okay.
And he also apparently pushed back against earlier tariff fears, claiming predictions of prices skyrocketing were far off, and it simply hasn't happened.
So his belief, as quoted, is that the tariff issue will fade, the bill passes, economy booms.
That's the gist of the quotes the source provides, yeah.
Yeah.
Tariffs subside, bill passes, economy grows, households benefit. But then
the source immediately throws in counterpoints.
Immediately. It mentions Walmart saying it will raise prices, and it notes that Trump himself was talking about more tariffs just a few days before those Sunday shows.
So the source presents that as a direct clash of information.
Very clearly, yeah.
Okay, moving to another area the source highlights. It confronts Speaker Johnson about SNAP and Medicaid changes, using stats from his home state, Louisiana.
Yes. The source lays out some pretty stark numbers for Louisiana. 1.4 million on Medicaid, over 800,000 on SNAP, calls Louisiana the second biggest food stamp recipient state.
And it makes a claim about his own district.
It does. It specifically claims, according to its interpretation, that hundreds of thousands in his district stand to lose Medicaid under this bill.
And then the source makes a really strong accusation about what Johnson admitted.
Yeah, this is a very pointed claim from the source. It states Johnson had to admit he thinks people in his district on these programs are essentially fraudsters, or criminals.
Wow.
Implying, in the source's words, that he's going after his own people. That's the framing.
How does the source quote Johnson responding to that kind of charge?
Well, his response, as quoted, is a denial. He says they are not cutting Medicaid, are not cutting SNAP. Instead, he says they're targeting fraud, waste, and abuse.
Does he provide any basis for that claim in the source?
He cites a statistic presented in the source that $11 billion in SNAP payments were erroneous in 2024.
Okay, so using that number to justify the focus on fraud. And his explanation for why there's fraud, something about the states.
Right. He's quoted explaining that, in his view, states aren't managing the programs well because they don't have enough skin in the game.
Meaning they don't have a financial stake.
Exactly. So the source quotes him saying the bill introduces a modest state sharing component. States would have to cover a small part of the cost.
And the argument presented is that this will incentivize them to reduce fraud.
Yes, that's the rationale quoted. Reduce fraud, preserve benefits for the truly needy. He calls it common sense, good government.
And did the source include his comments about his own district specifically in relation to fraud?
It did. It quotes him saying essentially, every district in America has people who are on the program who shouldn't. He gives an example.
The able-bodied man example.
Yeah, a young able-bodied man with no dependents who should not be working. And adds that his party believes in human dignity and finding purpose through work. So the source shows his justification alongside its own very critical framing.
Got it. The material also seems to pivot to a completely different topic that came up this Trump Memcoin dinner.
Yeah, kind of out of left field, but it was apparently discussed in the interviews the source covers. The source describes it as this closed-door event for big investors in Trump's private crypto.
It raises questions.
It does. Notes the attendee list wasn't public, asks about foreign money, potential conflicts with the president regulating crypto while also being involved.
And it poses that hypothetical question about party affiliation.
Right. It explicitly asks, would the outrage be different if a Democrat did this?
How did Speaker Johnson respond when asked about this dinner, according to the source?
His first reaction, per the quotes, was deflection. I don't know anything about the dinner. I was a little busy. I'm not going to comment,
But then he defended Trump more broadly.
Immediately after, yes. The source quotes him praising Trump, very active, very engaged, greatest deal maker. Says he's working on trade, encourages tech like crypto and AI, even mentions appointing an AI czar.
And the source connects this back to a strategy.
Yeah, it brings in a quote from Mediate's Aaron Rupar, who apparently called this a known deflection strategy from the first Trump term. Presents it as a deliberate tactic.
Okay. So we've covered the Republican criticisms as the source lays them out and how it shows Speaker Johnson defending his positions on the budget, tariffs, social programs, even that crypto dinner thing. But the source material also includes pushback from Democrats, right?
Oh, yes. Significant criticism. The source quotes unnamed Democratic Congress members right away. One had a pretty sharp line.
The 1984 comparison.
That's the one, saying listening to Johnson was like listening to 1984.
And these Democrats, according to the source, laid out what they see as the public's priorities for a budget.
Yeah, three main things, as quoted. Wealthy pay more taxes, tax relief for middle-lower class, tackling the deficit. They mentioned the U.S. credit rating downgrade, and a simpler tax code. That's the benchmark they set up in the source.
And their verdict on this bill against that benchmark.
They're quoted saying, it fails spectacularly on all three counts. That's the direct quote.
Why? What were their arguments as presented?
They claim it cuts Medicaid and nutrition aid for tens of millions while preserving tax breaks for the rich. They argue it adds $3 trillion to the deficit. And instead of simplifying taxes, they say it gums up the tax code, mentioning things like taxes on tips and auto lending rules. The source presents it as a total failure by their standards.
The source also highlights Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett.
Yes, she gets quite a bit of attention in this material. She's quoted calling the bill really a cruel bill.
And she challenges the fiscal responsibility claims.
Directly. The source quotes her pointing to the first Trump administration adding $8 trillion to the national deficit. And then she notes, this current